Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining us today. My name is Tamara Fathi, and I am a member of CIJA's Young Leaders Circle. Today, I am pleased to be joined by two avid Israel enthusiasts, Shimon Koffler Fogel, CIJA President and CEO, and Adir Krafman, Associate Director of Communications and Analytics. Tuesday, Israelis went to the polls for the fourth time in 2 years amidst an unstable government and intense political gridlock. Today, we will be trying to make sense of the election results and discuss the future of the Knesset through a Jewish Canadian lens. So let's jump right in. Shimon, I'm going to start with you. Why are Israelis going to the polls for the fourth time in 2 years? Shimon, you're on mute.
I'm on mute because Andrea put me on mute. They went to the polls because they needed an extra day to prepare for Pesach. That's the cynical view of a lot of Israelis that you'll speak to. For them, the significance wasn't that they had an opportunity to form a new government, but an expectation that the results were not going to resolve any of the gridlock that they'd experienced in the past three. And this was just preparatory for a fifth election in the fall. But obviously, the reason that they go back to elections is because Israeli society is so fractured into very, very discrete groups and interests that there has been an inability to form some kind of coherent and cohesive coalition that would provide Israelis with a degree of stability that could then govern for the normal period.
Just to add to that, on a technical level, the reason why we're going for elections the fourth time is because there was last year in the third round of elections, there was a unity government formed by the two largest parties. They had a power sharing agreement that included the rotation of the role of prime minister. When it was signed last year, there were some who said, no, this is never going to work out. There's no way that this kind of ideologically different coalition is going to last for long. Some were more hopeful, but as we all saw, this government dissolved and was not able to continue. They weren't actually even able to pass a budget, which led to these elections. But as Shimon said, I think the only thing that we can start thinking about is the fifth round of elections.
Oh gosh, yeah. So very, very fractured. So then, who do you see as the winners and losers from this election? Are there winners or losers? I mean, certainly there are losers, but are there actually any winners in this election?
So I think
Adir? Oh, sorry, Shimon. Go ahead. No, please.
So I would say there are three losers and one winner. So the first loser, I think, I would say that the first loser is Netanyahu, who despite his party winning the most number of seats, 30 seats out of the 120 in the Knesset, is still not able to form a government. Throughout the campaign, he anticipated being able to form a strong right-wing government with the support of his allies, but it's clear that there's no way that he'll be able to form any sort of ideologically coherent government. The other two losers are other right-wing parties, Naftali Bennett and Gideon Sa'ar, who believed that they would be able to rally significant numbers of voters from the right out of the Likud party and become major players in the political arena. Both of them really failed to do that, winning only with a handful of seats. But I will talk about one winner here. The winner is the party called Ra'am, led by Mansour Abbas. They're an Islamist party, Ra'am, and a little comment on the Islamic movement in Israel. It was formed in 1970. It's primarily focused on promoting religious values in Israel. In the late 90s, this movement split into two branches. The northern branch, which is more extreme, it doesn't recognize Israel's right to exist, it's affiliated with Hamas, and often gets in trouble with the law. And a second, more pragmatic branch, the southern branch, that is really willing to engage in the Israeli political system for the benefit of its communities. And until today, this party was mostly shunned by both sides of the political spectrum, by the Israeli left and the Israeli right. But now, because both sides aren't able to form the majority necessary to form a government, there are backroom chats and negotiations happening with this party for the first time. They've already made clear that they're looking for things specifically having to do with their population that they represent, mostly in the south of Israel, including recognizing Bedouin villages and providing financial supports for their communities and so on.
So, Tamara, if I could just add to that, I'll agree with Adir that Mansour Abbas's party, Islamist party, was a clear winner, though I would have a slightly different or nuanced take on what its significance is, and maybe we can explore that a little later. But in terms of winners and losers, it's interesting to note that each one of the main leaders has been able to put a particular spin on the election result to highlight where they think they can claim some sense of victory, if not absolute victory. And you can also offer a critique, much as Adir did on Netanyahu, that speaks to their lack of success. In the case of Likud, dropping a handful of mandates and not being able to persuade Israelis that a Netanyahu-led Likud is really their agent for economic recovery and consolidating the achievements in the vaccination process and so forth. But the truth can be said, Tamara, about all the leaders. I would argue that in terms of, for sure, winners and losers, there are two others that we have to consider. One is labor, avodah, where Meirav really rescued labor from absolute oblivion in being able to capture, I don't know, in the end, I think they got 7 seats or 7 mandates. That was more than many expected. In fact, some didn't think that they were really going to rise above the threshold. So I think that that's somebody who's a winner and will therefore be able to parlay that into counting as negotiations go forward. But I'd also flag Yvette Lieberman as a loser. He had a particular approach. It was focused very, very much and very harshly on an anti-Haredi sentiment. He didn't win the kind of support that he would have wanted to. But more than that, he actually triggered the same kind of response that Netanyahu did with respect to the Arabs in 2015, meaning that he propelled the Haredim to turn out in greater numbers than they would have otherwise. And that's significant because the overall turnout was lower by several percentage points from the last experience, but in the Haredi community, it increased. And there's lots of fascinating stuff to talk about there. So I think on two fronts, Avigdor Lieberman lost significantly. But the other thing that I would point to, and I should preface it tomorrow by saying, nobody within CIJA is partisan, and we don't express partisan views. But with respect to Netanyahu, it is important to note that his pivot away from what I just referred to, which was his 2015 targeting of the Arab threat as a way of trying to promote and incentivize people, Jewish Israelis, to vote. His pivot to an embrace of Abbas and of signaling that, yes, Arab Israelis are indeed a legitimate and full part of our society, and the implication that their issues have to be attended to, and they have to be addressed in an effective way, really does represent the only thing that saved him from further losses that he would have experienced. So I think that it could be argued that Netanyahu did win something, and so did Labor. For sure, Ram, the Islamist party, and I think that Avigdor Lieberman is, along with the others that Adir mentioned, a real loser in this experience.
Thank you, Shimon. Yeah, absolutely. And I think it'll be very interesting to see what happens with Ram. I mean, maybe, Adir, you've got this great presentation up here. Perhaps we can look to who do you see as the most likely to form the government, and what are the various alternatives? How do you see, the party, the Islamist party, playing into it?
Sure. So first, let's open the screen here and look at the way that the different parties have organized themselves into blocks. You have the pro-Netanyahu bloc that's led by Netanyahu, of course, with Likud, with the largest party with 30 seats, alongside the two Orthodox parties, Shas and United Toward Judaism, UTJ, with 9 and 7 seats, respectively. And finally, you have the religious Zionist party coming in at 6 seats. So together, they form 52, which in Israel's 120-seat parliament is not enough to form a 61 majority. On the other side, you really have a ideologically fractured coalition of parties ranging from the right-wing New Hope, a party led by Gideon Sa'ar that until this round of election was actually a part of the Likud, all the way through center parties, Yesh Atid, Blue and White, all the way to the left-wing parties, Labor and Meretz, and finally ending with the joint list, which in and of itself comprises of multiple factions, including even a communist faction. So they've sort of combined into the anti-Netanyahu bloc. Israelis are now referring to them as the change bloc. And in the uncommitted portion, you have Yamina, which is another right-wing party that has said that they haven't decided yet which camp they're going to affiliate with, and Ram, which is the party that we just discussed. If we go over here to our Path to Victory tool, you can see that no party can, no camp can really form a government without the support of Ram. So let's do a quick demonstration. If we take a Likud and we add to that the two ultra-Orthodox parties, United Toward Judaism and Shas, and to that we add the religious Zionist party. These are Netanyahu's natural partners. You get to 52. So even if the party of Naftali Bennett, Yamina, decides to join the pro-Netanyahu camp, they're still unable to form a government without the support of Ra'am. On the flip side of that, you have Yesh Atid's Yair Lapid, who's sort of the leader of the anti-Netanyahu camp, the change camp. And he, as well, is not able to form any government. If you take the centrist parties and you combine them with the left-wing parties of Labor and Meretz, even if you were and New Hope, even if you were to add the joint list to that, you would not be able to form a government without the support of the Ram party. And so we're really at this interesting deadlock between the two camps, and it's up to the smallest party to decide what direction the country will be going in.
Shimon, do you have some thoughts on this as well? Any chance that we see Netanyahu stepping down or otherwise?
So, Tamara, I think that's a great question, because for us, one step removed from it, and thinking in more sort of philosophical or ideological ways, we might be tempted to say, if Netanyahu really cared, he would recognize that he's an impediment for a strong and stable right-of-center government to be formed, and that for the sake of the country and the vision that he has, it would make sense for him to step down. That way they could conceivably eliminate the noxious side of the religious right wing. They could mitigate stuff by including a couple of centrist parties, because as Adir mentioned earlier, the left of center has less difficulty with Likud from an ideological perspective as they do with Likud with the Netanyahu leadership. So there might be some pressure for Netanyahu to say, this is the end of the road. You've done some magnificent things. it's time to move on. You have to resolve the cases that are now before the courts, and you have a legacy. So let's move on to the next generation. I think, again, from a nobility point of view, that would perhaps be the most powerful and unifying thing that Netanyahu can do for the country, bar nothing. But sometimes people are convinced that only they, in a micromanaging kind of way, have the capacity to navigate all of the challenges that a country has. And I fear that that's going to be Netanyahu's conclusion. And he's not without those who are prodding him on that. So I don't see that kind of noble, almost romantic outcome of this process, unless they were to throw in Netanyahu as president of the state. Rivlin's set to step down at the end of his term in just a few months. If a deal could be made about the court cases, and Netanyahu was promised that kind of Shimon Peres-like last chapter in his public service career, I think that he would be hard-pressed, and Sarah even more hard-pressed, not to accept that option, and that could change the entire dynamic.
Absolutely.
One thing to add to that, which complicates matters a little bit, is that a lot of people don't know that Likud is more than a party. It is actually a movement, and it is one of the last remaining internally democratic parties within the Israeli political system. So what I mean by that is that for example, if you look at some of the smaller parties, like Yesh Atid or New Hope, the leader of the party is sort of decides who gets to join the list and join the candidate list and run for office. That is not the case with Likud. Likud, the list of Likud is determined by internal primary elections. And there were multiple times when contenders tried to remove Netanyahu from the top of that list. But every time Likud goes through an internal primary, it's evident that the vast majority of Likud voters are extremely dedicated and loyal to Netanyahu. And any form of internal pressure from within the party to oust Netanyahu or try to get Netanyahu to concede will simply not work. So as Shimon said, this kind of thing would have to come from Netanyahu himself.
Yeah, it was just probably not very likely, but maybe he will do the noble thing. We'll have to wait and see, I guess. So maybe switching gears a little bit, what do you view the differences in this election from the previous three? I mean, 4 elections in such a short time. How is this one any different than the last 3?
Well, it turns out that it's not that much different. In terms of not resulting in an outcome that provides a definitive indication of a bloc that could lead the country. What has changed, I think, Tamara, is that the circumstances and the challenges facing Israel have evolved, and much of it is as a result of COVID, or what they call the coronavirus. There are some pretty daunting challenges out there, most especially on the economic side. And we see that some other countries have already begun to emerge with a fairly robust recovery. Israel isn't there yet. And Israel's situation, of course, is complicated by so many other things. So there is a sense of urgency that they do have to get an Israeli government in place that is going to be able to effectively address these issues. And it's not clear that this election result will offer that to Israelis. So I think it makes the situation, if anything, more desperate.
Adir,
I completely agree with that. I think in the first 3 rounds, there was a sense of energy of both sides of the political spectrum, ready to go the distance in order to achieve victory. The Israeli voter came out with really high voter turnouts. This is the first 3 rounds, and this time it's a completely different level of energy. You can see it with the interviews that the various Israeli news channels have done on the street, and you can see it with the members of Knesset who are being interviewed. Everyone is tired. Obviously, this has to do with the coronavirus pandemic, but also the amount of energy, time, and money that running an election takes 3 times in a row. Now the 4th time. I think the price, the personal and political price that any candidate who is blamed for a return to a 5th round of elections this time around will be a very high price. And so that thing will be taken into the sort of the calculus of the different political parties, whether they decide to make significant and unprecedented compromises with the other parties to find some sort of creative solution or go back to a 5th round of elections.
Yeah, that'll certainly be something to see. Continuing along the lines of the coronavirus pandemic, Shimon, you mentioned that other countries are seeing a robust economic recovery already, and yet Israel still hasn't. How do you think that the pandemic impacted the results of the election? Certainly, a lot of the articles here in Canada that we were reading about, that Netanyahu was doing such a great job when it came to vaccinating the country, and that this would be a test to his candidacy. So how do you see that having been impacting the election?
Yeah, so there's an expression in the Talmud called "Yatsa schara behefsedo," that what was gained was lost, was offset by what was lost. So I think that Netanyahu had the expectation, and he certainly tried to frame part of his campaign message on, look how skillfully I was able to organize adequate supply of vaccine, and how we're at a point that is leading the world in terms of the vaccination of the population. And he thought that was going to be one of the accelerators to push him over the top. But it came in the same context as bitterness. It wasn't just disappointment. It was profound bitterness across the spectrum with the way the Netanyahu government managed the pandemic. And it was just one catastrophe after the other that did a lot of harm to people objectively, but also exacerbated and polarized the Israeli society in a variety of different ways, most notably the antipathy towards the Haredi community that was perceived as having been indifferent at best, or mocking of pandemic protocols, and enabled to do so by the Netanyahu government. So I think that it was at best for Netanyahu a wash, where he neither gained nor lost as a result of that.
I think the campaign of the Likud running on three things: vaccinations, and vaccinations. Did a lot to remind voters that Netanyahu really pushed forward with helping essentially end the coronavirus pandemic in Israel. In Israel right now, it's they're having concerts and most things are open. It would appear that things are almost completely back to how they used to be. But at the same time, as Shimon said, there's a great frustration by large swaths of the Israeli population about the relationship between Netanyahu and his so-called natural allies in the parliament, namely the Orthodox parties, and how in order to retain their unconditional support, he's willing to turn a blind eye to almost a complete rejection of lockdowns and other pandemic measures within the ultra-Orthodox community. In terms of how the pandemic impacted the result, I mean, the results, you can see that the results look almost identical to the previous three results, but it's just really the way that the campaigns of the different parties have run. Many parties ran, it's about the economy, stupid kind of campaigns, looking at the next day, looking at how we can rebuild the economy moving forward. And I think that as sort of Israelis leave lockdown and go back to life and start to measure the economic damage that the pandemic has caused, we're going to see that kind of impact play out.
Yeah, definitely. And, you mentioned earlier the issue of vaccinations. What else did you see, or both you, Adir and Shimon, what were the key policy issues contested during this election? Obviously economy and economic recovery and the vaccinations, but what else?
So I think Adir is going to agree with me, because we actually had a chat about this just the other day. Yes, Tamara, to be sure, there were those that paid attention to or offered rhetoric on the issue of the economy writ large. But it's not as if somebody came forward with a particular and specific program for how they were going to get the country back operating at peak capacity and recover from the injury and insult caused by the pandemic. The truth is that policy wasn't the issue during this election. From the very beginning, it was understood that this is a referendum on Netanyahu. Does he merit the support of the country, notwithstanding his deficiencies, because of the skill set that he brings to governance and advancing Israel's interests? Or has he effectively disqualified himself, and the country has to now repudiate him as having the credibility to serve as prime minister? And the outcome was split. As Adir noted earlier, those that are supportive of Netanyahu are passionate about him and believe he is the only one who can move forward. We kibitzed before that there are those that talk about King Bibi as the prime minister, and the anti-Bibi side talk about not a prime minister, but a crime minister. And that really, in a nutshell, is what the focus of the election was, a referendum on his ability to continue leading the country.
I can talk about one sort of policy category that was discussed, and one thing that actually wasn't discussed. So if we go back to the screen of the pro Netanyahu bloc and the anti-Netanyahu bloc, what really unifies the anti-Netanyahu bloc is a particular take on the division between religion and state. So in Israel, the conversation is very fierce between these two political sides on issues like reform versus Orthodox conversion in Israel and the recognition of the state of that, space for conservative and reform worshippers at the Kotel in Jerusalem, legalizing civil marriage and gay marriage and things like that. And so even though these topics weren't explicitly discussed during the campaigns, there is still that underlying tension between the more socially conservative and socially liberal camps. But I can tell you one thing that was almost not discussed whatsoever, and that is the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. There was very little discussion about it. There is almost a consensus opinion that the negotiations right now are at a stalemate. And really the focus was almost entirely on Israel's internal matters. However, I will say that there is a theme that emerged as the numbers were being crunched, and that is the shift of the Arab Israeli population and their elected representatives away from a focus on the Israel-Palestinian conflict and their own domestic affairs. And this is an extremely significant shift that will have long-term consequences for Israel's political system. So if we go over to this map, this is a map showing the by communities how different communities voted. And I'll remind our viewers that unlike in Canada, where we vote for candidates, in Israel, you vote for the list. So it's not like these are writings, this is just voter trends throughout the map. And you can see that around Tel Aviv, there's a majority of support for the more secular parties. Contrast that with Jerusalem, where there's more support for the ultra-Orthodox parties. But one thing I want to focus on is these green and yellow patches over here. So in this election, you had two parties that were comprised of primarily Arab candidates. One was the joint list, which, as I said before, is multiple factions within it, but which primarily speaks to the Israel-Palestinian conflict, the rights of Palestinians, the peace agreements, the status of the West Bank, or Judea and Samaria, and so on. And they do very little to help the communities that they actually seek to represent. And the second party is Ram, which we also talked about, which is the Islamist party that has specifically said that its objective is to improve the quality of life for Arab Israelis, and particularly the Bedouin Israelis that live in Israel's south in the Negev. And you can see a clear division within the Arab vote. You can see that the ones that are sort of closer to areas A and B of the Palestinian Authority, they voted more green. Where though, if you look here in the south of Israel, it's almost uniformly, or it is uniformly yellow. And this shift, both on the Arab side and on the Jewish side, with Jewish parties saying, "Hey, well, we can't form a government without the support of Arab parties." I think this is going to have a positive and long-term impact on the way that Israeli Arab and Israeli Jewish politicians work with each other in the future.
Shimon, do you have some thoughts on the map as well?
So I think that the trends that Adir flagged are really significant, but there's another dimension to them that I don't think we should lose sight of. He prefaced it by saying the one thing that was not discussed or debated in the election was Palestinian-Israeli negotiations, a peace process, or that kind of thing, which is always featured in some way or other in previous campaigns. When we consider, Tamara, the significance of Abbas's achievement, the Islamist party leader, it's not just that he was able to attract significant support for an orientation that said, we have to take care of our parochial interests. And the way to do that is to become relevant within the Knesset, within the political process. And that's where I'm going, rather than some abstract ideological orientation that really doesn't achieve anything except, issue a statement in point of principle. What he did was translate the breaking of the boycott that has begun within the Gulf states and reflected in the Abraham Accords, but the boycotts of Israel to a transition of cooperation with Israel. It could be out of love, or it could be out of realpolitik, or just simple practical considerations, but it has breached that gulf, and it has moved segments of the Arab-Israeli community into an entirely different place. So if I'm looking for significance and even optimism that we can point to in the result of this electoral campaign, it's that I think that Arabs have now shifted, or begun the process of shifting, into full empowerment and sense of shared ownership of their destiny and of what the country is going to look like. And that extends not just to those who supported the Islamist party. It's also to be seen in the Haredi community. So leaving aside all of the challenges between the Haredi perspective and the secular perspective and the gulf between the two, we actually have seen significant movement within the Haredi community. And they've moved away from Shas and the United Torah to Likud and to the religious Zionists. And that's significant. We see it in the pure Haredi, we see it in Chabad, which has moved a lot of its votes in significant ways. Because what it's saying is they are no longer going to be held hostage to the dictates and the direction of their rabbinical leaders. That they're making their own calculations about what's in their best interests, what's going to advance their quality of life, their positioning. And so they have now erased the constraint or the barrier of attaching themselves to a Zionist enterprise, for example, in both respects, or recognizing the legitimacy of other religious but not Haredi segments of Israeli society. So it may be that we will look retroactively as this being an important milestone in the change of a societal dynamic that will ultimately prove to Israel's benefit because it will allow for more inclusion and diversity to be captured within different units.
Right.
Thanks,
and one thing I would add to that is that we often think about politics in a traditional right wing versus left wing sort of axis, but here what we often see is that even after elections are done and there's a Knesset, the religious secular axis and the national right wing left wing dynamic often cross, and sometimes they overlap. For example, if you look at Ram, the Islamist party, and you compare them with the more nationalist right-wing parties, on the political side, they have very little in common, right? They're obviously not going to take a hawkish position on the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, and they would support more compromises on the Israeli side. But if you compare Ram with Shas and United Torah Judaism, there are so many initiatives that we don't hear about that they take together, parliamentary initiatives, for example, increased supports for religious institutions, more funding for synagogues and mosques, support for families with more children than the average secular family would have. Even the power and authority of the rabbinate, or in case of the Muslim community in Israel, the Qadi, there are so many things that they have in common. And so this new sort of legitimacy for these parties in the Israeli political system, I think will lead to a lot of interesting combinations, when it comes to new laws being formed.
Definitely. Thank you, Adir. So now switching gears a little bit, but probably what a lot of people have on their minds right now, being that we are in Canada, is what does this mean for Canada-Israel relations? What does it mean for Canadian Jewry, this outcome right now of the fourth election and what we're looking at? And also your thoughts maybe on what will occur should a far right wing emerge. Shimon, I'll start with you.
So Tamara, I think that there are two things that we have to look at. Internal to the Jewish community and our relationship as a diaspora community to the Jewish state. And then there's the broader question of the bilateral relationship between Canada and Israel. So taking them in order, I think, speaking frankly, a construction of a right-wing government that includes political movements or parties whose values are antithetical to what mainstream consensus Jewish community's orientation here is, will be a challenge. It's going to test our ability to offer unconditional, unqualified support. for a variety of reasons. Some have to do with religious issues and the extent to which pluralism may be compromised. Some have to do with social values. Adir touched on a couple of them. So I think that there's going to have to be a set of important conversations that diaspora Jewry have with such a government to ensure that our voice is not only heard, but there's responsiveness to what our voice says. The Supreme Court just came out with a ruling. Many people hailed it. I actually was saddened by it because the court never wanted to take that position. It didn't feel that it was its place to enshrine the empowerment and the access of various streams or denominations within Judaism. It had an expectation and waited 15 years for the Knesset to do it, and it failed to do it. So, there are issues out there, Tamara, that really require our attention, our collective attention, both inside of Israel and outside. In terms of the broader bilateral relationship, I think that the most important consideration that we can focus on is the issue of inattention. If Israel is paralyzed and distracted by an inability to move forward in terms of governance and establishing or confirming a stable government to lead the country, then it means that other issues, including those on the bilateral agenda, will suffer from neglect. Ministerial visits back and forth, the completion of outstanding agreements on innovation, partnership on things like water management and the like. All of those issues will suffer if there isn't a stable government in place that can pair up and partner with their Canadian counterparts. And Canada is going to be a little hesitant to opine too strongly on a whole range of things because it will not want its comments or statements or actions to be misinterpreted as somehow unintentional or even intentional support for one partisan direction as opposed to another.
I think one thought I had while listening to Shimon, I agree with everything he said, is just to remember that the Canada-Israel relationship is based on shared values and a shared and a strong friendship, not just on a government level, but on a people to people level. And I think that regardless of the outcomes of the election, both in Israel and in Canada, that kind of friendship will continue. As a Canadian, I'll say I was very proud to see a Canadian in government the last time with member of Knesset Koffler Fogel. In Knesset, it was when there were parliamentary proceedings with English guests, and I could hear that familiar Canadian accent. It was very nice, and it's unfortunate that she stepped out of the political game. But it does point to a trend of more and more English speakers from Canada, from the United States and other places moving to Israel and becoming actually quite a significant constituency. In Israel, they call them the Anglos. And what I hope to see is that the pluralistic values that Shimon mentioned, the pluralistic values that we hold so dear in North America, that this Anglo constituency will become more politically active and be able to push them forward in the political game. Yep, I think you're muted.
Thank you. Yes, I was muted. I'm actually going to take a couple of questions from the audience. One in particular is related to Ram. Just who supports Ram? Is it supported by the Muslim Brotherhood? Is this a party that we should be more concerned about?
So, like I said before, Ram is part of the sort of the Islamic movement, and if you look at from religious orthodoxy, from a religious perspective, there is a connection between Ram and the Muslim Brotherhood. A sister organization is Hamas, the terrorist organization that controls the Gaza Strip, and this sort of antipathy towards Israel. But in the 1990s, there was a major split in the Islamic movement in Israel into two main factions. The first one is more congruent with Hamas and the Muslim Brotherhood and all that jazz we can call. And the second one has really broken away from that and shifted their attention towards pragmatic means to improving the quality of life of their communities in mostly in the south of Israel. Now, to say that they will, have a picture of Herzl or Golda Meir in their living room, no, that's not the expectation here. They'll never, become Zionists. But I think there's a place to work on a pragmatic level. When it comes to different economic policies and different social policies, that more and more political parties in Israel will see them as viable partners, and some will not. Some will say under no circumstance will be willing to talk to non-Zionist parties in Israel, and that's part of the conversation that's actually happening right now as we speak.
Shimon, do you have any thoughts to add?
No, other than, look, the evolution that we're seeing within Israel or Arab parties in Israel is also an echo of what's happening in larger parts of the Muslim world, where there's a almost deliberate decision being made about to what extent does Islamic theology, should it govern the decision-making and the behaviors of faithful Muslims? Adir, I don't think, was far off earlier on when he talked about some commonality between the Haredi parties and Ram in terms of some of the issues on which there would be convergence in terms of shared interests and shared positions. So I think that there are those who are doubling down on an ideological Islamist view, and there are those like Ram who are saying, for adherence to Islam, this is what's in our interests. And so they become much more practical, far less ideological, and that has to be noted. The one area in which I think there's a big question mark is, even with that virage in the 90s to a more practical approach to politics and participation in the political process, it's not as if they're completely untethered to the larger Muslim world. If hostilities were to break out in Gaza, for example, what kind of impact would that have on Ram's positioning? Would Ram be a constrainer in terms of latitude that an Israeli government that relies on its support has in terms of a response in Gaza? Or would it feel that this is one of those issues on which it has to declare its solidarity with the Ummah, with the Muslim Arab world, against the Israeli government, and that could be a potential flashpoint for a political crisis.
On the notion of the Ummah or the Muslim nation, looking at from the perspective of the individual Arab Israeli, with Israel's founding, the community in the Arab community in Israel was totally disconnected from the Arab world. And actually, a few years ago, I visited Cairo in Egypt, and I was really astonished by just the level of connectivity between the different Arabic-speaking communities across the Middle East. And for years, the Arab community in Israel was disconnected from that. Later, there were peace agreements with Egypt and Jordan, and that the situation improved a little bit. Now, when you're looking at the ability of an Arab Israeli who lives in Haifa or in the south to visit the Emirates, even as a tourist, this had a significant impact on the way that they view the future of their relationship with the state. The state is no longer a block, something that's preventing them from interacting with their with people other communities who share their culture and language across the region, but rather there could be some symbiotic relationship here. And I think that we look at the Abraham Accords as only from the top level political perspective and the dynamics of different states in the Middle East, but on a human level, I think this really had an impact on the way that Arab Israeli communities in Israel view the state, and it's reflected in Ram making the statements that they did.
You're still on mute, Tamara.
Sorry. I was so good at the beginning of this, and now I forget to take myself off mute. Apologies. So one final question from our audience, and then I'll ask you both for some final thoughts. But how likely is another power sharing agreement between Netanyahu and Gantz? Do you see that as a likelihood, or given the fact that we just had a fourth election, that's highly unlikely?
So I can give you a really quick answer. Adir might have a different take because he likes playing with numbers more. But people have put forward theoretically a lot of different scenarios towards that now famous path to power, and none of them stand up, including one that has Gantz joining with Netanyahu. So I think, barring some dramatic development or some epiphany, as I romantically described earlier regarding Netanyahu, it's almost inevitable that one of two things is going to happen. Either they're going to succeed in electing a new speaker and they will introduce legislation that disqualifies Bibi, and that changes, of course, the whole game, or they will go to a fifth election in the fall.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more with Shimon. These are the two most likely outcomes right now. Last year, Benny Gantz led the major push to say, I will replace Netanyahu. There was basically the people who voted for him for one reason and one reason only, and that is to replace Netanyahu, to move Netanyahu from power. And after signing, and then Corona hit, and he made the decision to join into a power sharing agreement. Also, there were a few deserters who moved from the blocks, and Benny Gantz, in his defense, he realized that without agreeing to a power sharing agreement, it's likely that a fiercely right-wing party would have been able to form in Israel in the parliament, and that would have had different consequences on passing different laws that would actually save Netanyahu from the three corruption charges. So he said, I had no choice. This was the best outcome, and I put Israel first. That's one of his slogans. But from March 2020 to March 2021, the entire year, Benny Gantz went through a battery of abuse, one could call it, where in every interview, in every time he was filmed on the street, people would ask him the same thing: How could you do this to us? How could you betray the trust of your voters? And I think it's extremely unlikely that he's going to make that same decision again.
Yeah. So final thoughts. We have just a few minutes left before closing. Adir, maybe I'll start with you and then give Shimon the final word.
Yeah. So one last thing I will say is that in terms of the stability and governance, it's a terrible thing to have to go through 4 rounds of elections and looking like they're going to go to a 5th round of elections. But I think, you know, from a personal perspective, it's always interesting to see the different dynamics of Israeli society. It reminds us that Israel is such a vibrant democracy with all these different players and different actors, and one of the most democratically engaged communities, right? Even looking at the voter turnout that Shimon touched on earlier, which is the lowest out of the 4 rounds of elections, even then it's one of the highest voter turnouts that you could find. So yes, there's fatigue, but at the same time, Israelis are very ideologically driven, no matter where they are across the political spectrum, and it's always interesting to see that sort of dynamism.
Absolutely. Shimon?
So Tamara, I'm going to end off on an optimistic note. I think that there are some encouraging things, elements of this outcome that we can hold on to. We touched on them in terms of the growth and maturity of both the Haredi and Arab Israeli communities. I hope that we will see political leadership across the spectrum foster that kind of movement that would really speak to enhancing the quality of life, not just for the particular groups, but towards generating a greater sense of national unity. I also think that Israelis themselves, at least the ones that I've been speaking to over the last number of days, are being prompted to ask themselves questions about what should they be demanding or articulating from their political leadership. And it seems to me there may be a growing movement where there's a recognition that you get the government that you deserve, and that if they want a different outcome, they're going to have to be articulating different kinds of demands on their political leadership. Because ultimately, the parties are responsive to what they perceive their constituencies want to hear. And if their constituencies want to hear something more constructive, or want to see something more constructive, then that's the message they're going to convey to their leadership. In terms of our relationship with the Jewish state, I think that this experience reminds us that we can't be passive in that relationship, that we have to engage with, we have to actively connect to, and we have to share our perspective that should enrich the public conversation that takes place in Israel. I think events like this one that you've hosted are good opportunities for us to stay engaged and to prompt us to translate better awareness and more knowledge into more direct involvement. And that's what I hope will emerge from this.
Thank you, Shimon. Thank you, Adir. I certainly love ending on such an optimistic note. We certainly cannot be passive and absolutely must continue to stay engaged. I want to thank everyone for coming. Again, a huge thank you to Adir and to Shimon for your insights. I hope that everyone in our audience has found this an informative discussion. And I wish everyone a wonderful Pesach. So thank you all so much.